So today, really, the focus of our seminar isn't going to be honing in on any one particular religion in China, but giving more of an overview of the different religions that currently coexist in China, their historical impact on China, and the cultural impact that they continue to have to this day. So in order to sort of structure it in a more kind of cohesive way, the first half of the seminar, I'll be talking about the three major indigenous Chinese religions. And then in the second half, I'll be talking about the three major foreign religions that have had a cultural impact in China. So the first half is all focused on indigenous religions, religions that came from China. And then the second half will be all about foreign religions, so religions that traveled into China, but then continued to sort of build up steam and had a major impact. So this does not sort of preclude any of the many, many, many different foreign religions that did have a major, major impact on China at some point. Religions like Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism. I won't be talking about them today, but I would strongly recommend people to do some reading on those because they are incredibly interesting, and they did have perhaps not as big of an impact as the ones I'll talk about today, but still something of an impact. Also, they're really cool. In Zoroastrianism, you get to worship a fire god and you stand around a big fire pit and like pray and stuff. And it is still an active religion. So look into it. But for now, we're going to jump into, we've just had a couple of people join in. We're going to jump into the first indigenous religion. So before we get started, it's important to note that the Chinese Communist Party is secular in China, and it actually celebrates the fact that China is a secular country. So it is often pushing this sort of narrative of China being incredibly secular and being almost borderline quite hostile towards religions. This is because throughout Chinese history, religion often represented an alternative nexus of power that often led to challenges against authority and eventually uprising. So most of the major rebellions and revolts in Chinese history have been due to religion, such as the, oh my God, I've forgotten it now, the Heavenly Kingdom. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, so the Taiping Heavenly Rebellion, and the Yellow Turban Rebellion, one of which the first one was a Christian rebellion, second one was a Muslim rebellion. So the Chinese Communist Party, however, does acknowledge the existence of 5 major religions that people are legally allowed to practice in the country. So before we sort of jump into what they are, I'd be interested to see, can anyone in the chat name what they think they are? What are the 5 major religions that are officially recognized by the Chinese Communist Party? Does anyone know, or would anyone like to have a guess? I feel like some people have been to this seminar before, so some people will know. Wing says Taoist. That is absolutely correct. So Taoism is one of them. Do we have any other guesses? I nearly read that as toast for a second. So Christian is, yeah. Manalia said Christian is, Hinduism isn't. Buddhism, Wing, you're absolutely, and Joe, you're absolutely right. Buddhism is one. Susan said Confucianism. Yep, that's absolutely right. So Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Christianity are all. So we've got Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Christianity. That's 4. But there is a 5th one as well. There, everyone is missing out. Not Judaism, which is surprising. Islam, yes, exactly. So the 5 major religions in China are Taoism, Buddhism, Islam. Oh, I've gotten that wrong. Confucianism isn't one, of course. Confucianism isn't recognized. Got completely mixed up then. So the bizarre thing about the way the major religions are recognized is the fact that Christianity is separated into 2 religions. So Catholicism and Protestantism. So you've got Taoism, Buddhism, Islam, Catholicism, and Protestantism. Confucianism isn't regarded as a religion in China. It's regarded as a school of thought / philosophy. So it kind of slips under the radar. Now, the main reason why Christianity is listed specifically as Catholicism and Protestantism, and why they're kept separate, is mainly a control issue, as other types of Christianity, such as baptism or Methodism, are viewed as too radical and have a greater potential to become subversive, so to become sort of go against the government. Trace said I was hoping for Bond. Yeah, Bond unfortunately didn't make the cut, as you can imagine. So yeah, the main reason why Catholicism and Protestantism are both listed separately is because other versions of Christianity, particularly baptism and Methodism, are considered to be too subversive. Even the Catholic Church in China is ultimately under the government's control and has been separated from the head of the church in Rome. Now, you may note as well, as we just mentioned, 2 of the most sort of recognizable and important religions in China don't make this list. 1, Confucianism, and 2, what is referred to as Chinese folk religion. So therefore, the first three religions I'm going to be talking about in the first half are Confucianism, Taoism, and Chinese folk religion. I'll explain what that is a bit more in a second. So for now, let's get into Confucianism. If you're learning Chinese, Confucianism in Chinese is 儒家, just here, 儒家. So Confucianism is widely regarded throughout China as a school of thought, as I said, or a philosophy rather than an official religion, in spite of the fact that it sports its own pantheon of deities, which does include Confucius. So Confucius is regarded as a god within Confucianism. The basis of Confucianism was founded on the teachings of Confucius, which date back to the 5th century BC, so it's one of the oldest schools of thought in China. Although these teachings waned in popularity throughout subsequent years, they made a massive revival during the Tang dynasty, so around about the 7th century. This eventually led to the development of what's known as Neo-Confucianism during the Song dynasty, which was spearheaded by a scholar named Zhu Xi, one of the most important scholars aside from Confucius in Chinese history. In many ways, this movement was more of a counter-movement in response to what scholars perceived as the superstitious beliefs of Taoism and Buddhism at the time. So really, as I said, Confucianism regards itself as more of a school of thought, and particularly during this time, during the Song dynasty, there was this desire to move away from this sort of mysticism and this kind of vagueness and move towards something more concrete and more logical. So these scholars advocated for a return to secular and traditional values, which emphasized the family unit and the importance of social harmony. Zhu Xi's teachings ended up becoming so influential that they became a part of the imperial examination from 1314, and they remained a part of that examination until 1905, which cemented the cultural status of Confucianism in China. At its core, Confucianism is a humanistic philosophy. It places the greatest importance on the family unit and on social morality, believing that humans are inherently good and should always be striving to better themselves through the cultivation of traditional values. So it really kind of puts humans at the center of the teachings as opposed to deities or any kind of mystical teachings. So what are these traditional values? So most importantly, within Confucianism, you have what are known as the 5 constants. So you have 仁, which can be roughly translated to mean benevolence or humaneness. Yi, which can be translated to roughly righteousness or justice. Li, one of the hardest ones to translate. Most people refer to it as proper right, although I'll go into that a little bit more in a moment. And then the last two, which are dead easy to translate. Zhi means knowledge, and xin means integrity or truthfulness. So ren refers to the feelings of happiness or achievement that a virtuous person experiences when engaging in altruistic acts. It is simultaneously regarded as the essence of being human, so it's one of the easiest ones to achieve, and also as the main way in which human beings can get closer to heaven. So not only is it one of the easiest to achieve, it's also one of the ones that's most important. A lot of weight is placed on it. According to Confucius himself, in order to cultivate ren, a person must, and I quote, see nothing improper, hear nothing improper, say nothing improper, and do nothing improper. So kind of like hear no evil, see no evil. He defined it, and again, as I quote, as wishing to be established, a person should seek also to establish others. So very much a treat others as you would like to be treated kind of mentality. And this is meant to be really at the core of what it means to be human. So it's something that's naturally innate within us, and we're going against our own nature if we don't do it. So this one is coupled with yi, or righteousness, which can actually be translated to mean justice, morality, or righteousness. It refers to the moral disposition to do good, but also more specifically to the intuition and capability required to do so effectively. So this is a more complicated one and requires more effort from the individual. It means to go beyond simple rule following and to cultivate an understanding of the nuances associated with making moral judgments. It is therefore more clearly associated with decision making and problem solving. So it's not just about following the rules, but also So interpreting the rules and treating each situation differently based on your understanding of how justice works. So quite complicated compared to the first one, which is just be nice to people. The next one, Li, probably one of the most important of the 5 constants after Ren, it's become one of the defining features of Confucianism, and is sometimes referred to as customs or rules, although more often I see it referred to as proper right. It can also refer to religious rites that are designed to bring people closer to heaven. So, according to this concept, Confucius believed that harmony could ultimately be achieved through the performance and maintenance of certain rites and rituals, including even things as banal and sort of small and detailed as tea drinking. There's a correct way to do everything, essentially. And if you perform things in the correct way, you get closer to heaven. So these rites were designed to center and harmonize the 3 realms. So the 3 realms within Confucianism are heaven, earth, and mankind. We're a realm. So we're the realm that links heaven and earth, essentially. And the idea behind it is that if you perform things in the correct way, it harmonizes those realms together. The last 2, fortunately, are relatively self-explanatory. So zhi refers to the cultivation of knowledge, and xin to the cultivation of integrity and trustworthiness. Now, alongside these 5 constants, there's also one other really important integral part of Confucianism, and that is filial piety, which is the idea that you owe everything to your parents, and therefore everything you do should be in service to your parents. But moving swiftly on, because we don't have all the time in the world, and I could talk about Confucianism forever, we're now going to talk about the next one, Taoism. So Taoism, known in Chinese as Tao, Jiao. You'll see this character come up a lot. Jiao is used more often in association with religion, whereas obviously Rujia, which is Confucianism, doesn't use that term to distance itself from religion. So Taoism is one of the oldest religions in China, and references and sort of one of the oldest kind of proofs of this is the Guodianqu slips, which is something that I mentioned. If you ever attended some of my other historical classes, I tend to talk about the Guodianqu slips a lot because they're incredibly interesting. They're these sort of bamboo slips that date back to around about the 4th century. Now, what's really interesting about them, they're the oldest version of the Tao Te Ching that we have, which is the religious book associated with Taoism, but they're actually written on bamboo slips. So no one actually knows what the original arrangement of the Tao Te Ching was, because each different slip, they're all separated from each other. So you could actually arrange them in any given way. We have a rough idea thanks to there was a transcript in the Ma Wangdui tomb, which is the 2nd oldest version of the Tao Te Ching that we have. That's the one that we follow now. But this very, very original version has no real structure to it. So we still don't really know how the Tao Te Ching was intended to be read. I'm going completely off track now, and I should focus. So Taoism as a religion didn't really begin to exist until the 1st century AD, even though officially, in terms of its scripture, it dates back to around about the 4th century BC. So what was happening during the 1st century AD, and why is this so important? Well, it was around about the time that Buddhism began to gain a foothold in China. So before this point, Taoism was mainly practiced in private, and there was no real concept or distinction between the laity and the clergy. So you didn't have sort of monks or priests or nuns in the way that you do now. And most people who practiced Taoism, it wouldn't be their full-time job. They would be operating within a room of their home. They would help people when they needed them, when they needed to be helped. But then in their spare time, most of the time, they would be like farmers or just sort of regular members of the community. They weren't separated from the community in the way that they are now. So the main focus of Taoism is the pursuit of the Tao, which is normally translated as the way. Now, this is quite a nebulous concept. I'm sure anyone who's come across Taoism knows the Tao is sort of almost impossible to describe, and that's kind of by design. But it refers to a primordial entity that existed before all other things and from which all things developed. For this reason, Taoism places the greatest importance on trying to live as naturally and fluidly as possible, with a focus on a concept known as wu wei, or action without intention. Now, sometimes this is translated as spontaneous action. You can see the Chinese characters down here, either action without intention or spontaneous action. It is often seen as an antagonistic movement to Confucianism, as it takes an individualistic approach, so focusing on the individual person, as opposed to society as a whole, and also rejects the practice of rigid rituals and rites, instead preferring people to live in a natural way. It believes that conscripting people to rites is really an unnatural way of being and actually disturbs the individual harmony of that person. So maintaining the social order to a Taoist is secondary to the pursuit of individual fulfillment. So it's very much more focused on the individual and individual practice rather than on social harmony. So you can see why Confucianists didn't really like it that much. Now, the two main religious texts that serve as the foundation of the religion are the Tao Te Ching, which I'm sure a lot of people would have heard of today, and also the Zhuangzi. So the Tao Te Ching was supposedly written by Lao Tzu, who is the original philosopher of Taoism, although there are a lot of sort of philosophical debates about this, and a lot of people believe that Lao Tzu probably never existed as an individual, and the Tao Te Ching is most likely to have been a collective work written by many authors. We do know that the Zhuangzi was definitely written by one author because it's named after him. So the Zhuangzi was written and is based on the life of a philosopher called Zhuangzi. So these are the two foundational texts of Taoism. So now let's take a look at one of them. And this is one of my favorite chapters from the Tao Te Ching. So this is taken from chapter 25 of the Tao Te Ching. And this is really how chapter 25 finishes. So it's sort of the final end point rounding out this chapter. It's really, I've picked it because I really feel like it's very emblematic of what the way is. If you ever want to describe what the way is or the Tao is, this is a really good way of describing it. So in Chinese, if you ever want to read it or learn it, it's read as 人法地，地法天，天法道，道自然. So in English, this word fa is a difficult one to describe, but it means to, I've sort of translated it here as to model yourself on. So it's sort of like to come from or to base upon. So in this, people model themselves on the earth. So you have these three different kingdoms. People model themselves on the earth. The earth models itself on heaven. Heaven models itself on the way, so the Tao. And then this last bit is really, really hard to translate. I've seen it translated in many different ways because of these two characters, 自然, which means to be natural or to come from oneself, so to have no origin, but to be kind of self-creating. So it's really, really hard to kind of figure out exactly what it means or how to translate it in English. But I've put here the way is natural, but it could be something like the way is self-creating, or the way is the original, or the way comes from itself. All of those could potentially be valid translations. So to talk briefly as well about the Tao as a whole, what the Tao Te Ching actually means. Another important point, sorry, I've completely forgot about this, is that most importantly, it was the first religion that placed anything above heaven. So up until this point, you have these three kingdoms, people being lowest, earth being in the middle, and heaven being the highest, but people connecting the two. And then suddenly you have this fourth thing. So heaven was meant to be the highest possible high. And then all of a sudden you have this other thing, the Tao, which is placed above heaven. So this is really revolutionary back in sort of ancient China. And it really kind of cemented Taoism as different from the other religions because it had this extra thing that was placed so highly that it even went above heaven. So in terms of what the Tao Te Ching actually means, Tao means the way. De means virtue, but is normally used to be associated with sort of statecraft or proper governance. And then Jing means like a classic or a text. More often in English, it's referred to as the Tao Te Ching. So what's really interesting about this, you've got this character De. When I go back to that Guodian Chu slips moment where I was blathering on about these different slips of the writing, some people have actually argued, and even in the Ma Wangdui tomb, the version of the Tao Te Ching, is actually separated with De going first and Tao going after. So you've got this bit about statecraft in the text before, and you've got this bit about the way, the more mystical side of it after. And this has led a lot of sort of historians and religious historians particularly to believe that actually the Tao Te Ching's original function was as a political text. So it was designed to teach government, political leaders proper statecraft. And this really makes sense at the time when it was written, because it was a time in Chinese history where the country was very fractured. The Zhou dynasty was in a state of collapse, and a lot of different kingdoms were vying for power throughout China. So if you actually read it from that perspective, it makes a lot of sense as less of a mystical book and more of a kind of guide to statecraft. But for now, and this is kind of reinforcing this idea of things having a proper order and trying to live in a more natural way, but from the perspective of a leader. But that's me going completely off track. And now I will get back on track because we need to talk about other religions. So just to sort of finish up on Taoism. Taoism does have several different deities within the pantheon, so it is very firmly a religion. But in particular, you have what are known as the three pure ones. If you notice in the first slide I showed, this is them, the three pure ones. They're sort of the major deities that are associated with Taoism. But ultimately, in a similar way to sort of Hinduism, everything goes back to the Tao. So ultimately, those three pure ones aren't just meant to be lesser deities than the Tao, they're actually aspects of the Tao. So every single deity within Taoism is more like a distilled version of the Tao itself, but everything goes back to the Tao. So for now, before we move on to talking about Chinese folk religion, I want to show our first and only video of the day. Now, if you could stop the recording, that would be perfect. Perfect. So now we're going to move on to talking about our final indigenous religion before we take our 5-minute break, and that is Chinese folk religion. So I'll explain a little bit about what that is first. So Chinese folk religion really is too vast to talk about in one single setting, as it serves as an umbrella term for all spiritual customs and practices that lie outside of any of the official religions in China. So it's kind of used as a sort of catch-all term for all of these different types of cults, deities, and religions that don't really have either an official religion that they belong to, or don't even have a specific religion. Some of them are just literally gods that are worshipped in specific parts of China. So these practices are often regionally specific, although some deities have become popular throughout China. So tentatively, you could separate Chinese folk religion into 4 main categories, which are ancestor worship, deity worship, secret societies, and folk religious sects. So, for example, many long lineages in China will have temples dedicated to their ancestors, while many places throughout China worship river or mountain gods that are specific to their location. So things that wouldn't be sort of accessible or knowledgeable to people outside of those regions or people outside of those clans as well. You may be surprised to hear that one of the most famous secret societies in China is known as the Tiandi Hui, or Heaven and Earth Society. So they were originally known as Tiandi Hui, or Heaven and Earth, but can anyone here guess what the group is called today? They're less of a religious society now and kind of the opposite of what you'd associate with a religion. So what do we think Tiandi Hui is now as a group? If I say it has something of a bad reputation now, and this is kind of the way that a lot of secret societies went. Think of secret societies in general and what that could possibly be. Be interested to see what people guess. Everyone's being very quiet. No one wants to guess. That's all right. It's not Falun Gong. Falun Gong actually did start officially as a sort of religion. Tiandi Hui is much, much older. So Tiandi Hui predates the 19th century. Alison, you're absolutely right. It is the triads. So Tiandi Hui, which originally started their life off, Chinese Morrison dance, Morrison dances, I like that. Tiandi Hui started their life off as a religious secret society and then eventually became the mafia of China. They are the triads now. So trying to talk about all of the customs and deities today within Chinese folk religion would be impossible. So rather than going into all that depth, which I hope I will be able to do at a later date, I'm just going to list some of the most famous deities within Chinese folk religion. So first of all, you have the Jade Emperor, who is the god of heaven. If you came to our seminar on Chinese deities, I did more of a deep dive into who he is. And the same with the Queen Mother of the West, also known as Xi Wang Mu. So Xi Wang Mu, or the Queen Mother of the West, is a manifestation of pure yin. She's associated with the Kunlun Mountains. It serves as a shamanic inspiration. So a lot of shamanism is tied in with ancient shamanism in China. It's really tied in with this particular primordial deity. She's also often connected to death, immortality, and dark energy. So if you've ever read Journey to the West, for example, you'll know that the Queen Mother of the West is the one who is responsible for the peach trees, and the peaches themselves grant immortality to those who eat them, which sounds really lovely. On top of that, you also have Ma Zhu, who's a Chinese sea goddess with a large cult following in Fujian province and Taiwan because of their sort of seafaring history. And then you also have the 3 sovereigns, hugely famous within Chinese culture. You can't really escape them. These are Fu Xi, who's the patron of heaven. He's responsible for hunting, fishing, and writing. You have Shenlong. I've talked about Shenlong a lot in our a seminar on traditional Chinese medicine. He's the patron of humanity, and he's responsible for things like farming, medicine, and marketing. Would you believe it? And then the last one, Nuwa, the only female of the three. She's the patron of Earth, and she's actually responsible for creating mankind. So she created mankind out of dirt. After that, you also have the five deities, which are also sometimes referred to as the five kings, the most famous of which is the Yellow King, or Huangdi, who's considered to be the ancestor of all Chinese people. But after that, you have rather conveniently the other emperors. The green, black, red, and white emperors are the other five deities. So easy to remember because they're all associated with different colors. And for now, we will finally take a 5-minute break to center ourselves spiritually after all of that information. So it's now, which is Buddhism. So in Chinese, Buddhism is known as 佛教. So 佛 means Buddha, in case you're curious. But there is really a lot of debate in terms of Buddhism in China. There's a lot of debate about how and when Buddhism arrived into China. But the general consensus is that it arrived via monks from India traveling along the Silk Road sometime during the 1st century AD. We feel pretty sure about that. The arrival of Buddhism into China is evidenced by the numerous Buddhist temples and grotto complexes that can be found along the Silk Road. The most famous of which are known as, and this is kind of like a tongue twister for me, the 4 grand groups of grottos. I got it right that time, which are the Longmen grottos, the Mogao caves, the Yungang grottos, and the Maijishan grottos. I would strongly recommend visiting all of them. They're all really beautiful. So when talking about Buddhism in China, the first figure to come to mind would undoubtedly be the monk Xuanzang, who I just mentioned earlier, who made his journey to the west during the Tang Dynasty, so between 618 and 907. I do actually have a seminar where I specifically talked just about him and his life. So if anyone is interested in hearing that again, I do have our schedule kind of mapped out based on suggestions from people up until I think the end of November. But if anyone has any other seminars or travel presentations that we've done they'd like to see, please do email us and let me know at info@asiaculturaltravel.co.uk. But for now, so I could do that one on Xuanzang if people are really super interested in his life specifically. But for now, I'm going to talk more about Buddhism more generally. So throughout history, the different sects of Buddhism began to evolve and change in China, which led to the development of Chan Buddhism, which is known as Zen Buddhism in Japan, also Chinese esoteric Buddhism, and finally, perhaps the most famous and recognizable, Tibetan Buddhism. So Chan Buddhism is a form of Mahayana Buddhism that focuses on meditation and introspection. The main goal is to eventually achieve enlightenment and Buddhahood. So this is something that you only see in Buddhism in China. It's really interesting. So prior to this point, Indian Buddhism said that the highest achievement you could be granted if you became enlightened was a bodhisattva. So you could become a sort of like quasi-deity type figure within Buddhism, but you could never become a Buddha. Buddhas were way too high. It was way too much of an achievement. But then when Buddhism arrives into China, you already have all of these other religions in China, particularly Taoism, that state that if you are good enough and if you practice hard enough, you can achieve the highest levels of be deified. Essentially, you can become a god. So within Taoism, you could become an immortal, which is basically like the highest ranking deity within Taoism. If you cultivate yourself properly, you become immortal and you are granted godlike powers. So Buddhism is competing with that. To go back to marketing, I know someone mentioned about how funny it was that one of the deities created all of mankind and one of them was just involved in marketing. But really, this is a case of marketing. So a lot of Chinese monks within Buddhism realized that if they wanted to compete with a religion that was offering God on the table, they had to do the same thing. So all of a sudden you have the evolution of Chan Buddhism, which states that if you practice hard enough, you could actually achieve Buddhahood. You could become a Buddha, and you don't see that in Indian Buddhism. So it's a really interesting kind of split. I feel like I'm going off on massive tangents today, but I really like religion in China. It's probably my favorite topic to talk about. So Chinese esoteric Buddhism is based on the tantric and esoteric schools of Buddhism. It focuses on the execution and perfection of ritualistic gestures or poses, known as mudra, the recitation of mantras such as Om Padme Hum, I'm sure people will have heard of that before, and the use of mandalas as aids for meditation. Then finally, Tibetan Buddhism is a mixture of practices from Mahayana Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism, and the indigenous Tibetan religion of Bon. So the Maijishan grottos, I'll talk about one of the groups of grottos today, and this is my favorite one, so that's why I've picked it. No other special reason, sorry. So the Meiji-shan grottos were started during the late Qin dynasty, so around about 384 to 417, and were added to right up until the Qing dynasty between 1644 and 1911. They are made up of 194 caves that contain over 7,200 Buddhist sculptures and 1,000 square meters of murals. So this 16-meter tall, you can see it in the distance, he looks quite small, but the biggest statue within the Meiji-shan grottos is this statue of the Buddha. It's 16 meters tall, or about 52 feet. To put that into perspective, it's over 4 times the size of an African elephant. So it's absolutely massive. So that's me done with Buddhism. I feel like I kind of just ended that on a really weird note. This is back when I did my seminars from a notebook as opposed to having a script. So this is why it's a little bit more disjointed. But finally, the last religion I want to talk about today, of course, is Islam and the arrival of Islam. And although Islam isn't one of the sort of religions that you talk about a lot when it comes to China, it has had a massive impact on Chinese culture, and its arrival was very much sort of a turning point in Chinese history. So this photo here is of the Great Mosque in Xi'an, which is the largest mosque in China and one of the oldest. And again, for anyone who's learning Chinese, Islam in Chinese is known as Islan Jiao. So much like Buddhism, Islam arrived in China via the Silk Road, when Muslim traders began settling in the country during the 7th century. It became particularly influential during the Yuan dynasty, when the Mongolian rulers gave foreign immigrants a higher status over the native Chinese people. So in particular, followers of Islam were often prioritized for official positions and other positions over native Chinese people. This prompted thousands of Muslims from Central Asia to settle in China, some of whom were actually forcibly resettled by the Mongolians to help them govern their empire. Now, interestingly, China is the only place in the world where the position of imam, which is one of the higher positions within a mosque, can actually be held by a woman and not just men. So there are currently 10 different ethnic groups living in China that predominantly follow Islam. So these are the Hui people, the Uyghurs, the Kazakhs, the Dongxiang, the Kyrgyz, the Salar, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, the Bonans, and the Tartars, most famous of which are the Hui Muslims and the Uyghur Muslims, of which they both have very different histories, but I won't talk about that today because, again, I'll go off on a massive tangent. So I will talk about the Uyghurs a bit more at a later date, but for now I'm going to focus on the Hui ethnic minority and how in particular the Hui represent how Islam had a massive impact on China and Chinese culture. I think we're having a bit of a problem in the chat. I think someone is leaning on their keyboard. Manale, if you could just watch out on your keyboard because it's sort of gone a bit wild at the moment. So the Hui ethnic minority are the second most populous ethnic group in China and also the most prolific. They can be found pretty much everywhere in China, with a large presence in Xi'an, but also a really big presence in Gansu province and in the Ningxia Hui autonomous region. They are the result of the first Muslim settlers who came to China, but they look ethnically Chinese. And this is because a lot of these original Muslim settlers married into Chinese families. So unlike the Uyghurs who married within their own ethnic group, a lot of these original Muslim settlers married into Chinese families. And over the years, they've sort of lost their kind of Turkic features or Central Asian features and become more sort of ethnically Chinese. Now, to finish up with, Islam wasn't the third religion, I wasn't counting. To finish up with, we'll talk about our actual real third foreign religion today, which is Christianity, or in Chinese known as 基督教. So the first official evidence we have of Christianity entering China is what's known as the Nestorian Stele, which was written during the 8th century and asserts that Christians who reached the capital of Xi'an in 635 AD were allowed to establish places of worship and then propagate Christianity. In 845, however, Christianity was officially banned in China. It enjoyed a brief revival during the Yuan dynasty because it was led by the Mongolians, and bizarrely, although the Mongolians were kind of represented as being quite brutal, they were actually really kind of culturally amenable and they allowed people to practice their own religions. But then it was promptly banned again during the Ming dynasty following the collapse of the Yuan dynasty. It didn't really gain a foothold in the country until the 16th century, when Jesuit priests began arriving into China as missionaries. By dedicating themselves to the study of Chinese language and customs, some of these missionaries managed to maneuver themselves into highly important positions, and some of them, such as Matteo Ricci, even advised the emperor himself. As foreign powers began to encroach more and more on Chinese territory, missionaries from other sects of Christianity started to pour into the country. These missionaries were met with increasing hostility by the locals due to what they viewed as a kind of foreign cultural invasion and just a general foreign invasion, which is kind of what happened. In 1810, a man named Liang Fa would meet with a Presbyterian preacher named Robert Morrison, who had translated the Bible into Chinese and needed Liang Fa's help to mass produce it into leaflets. Now, little did they know that their actions would lead to the largest rebellion in Chinese history, which is again one of my favorite historical periods. Not favorite, I mean it was quite terrible, but like I find it incredibly interesting. Which is the Taiping Heavenly Rebellion, which I shamefully forgot the name of, particularly considering I wrote an entire essay about it when I was at university. So what's really interesting about the Taiping Heavenly Rebellion is it was spearheaded by this man named Hong Xiuqian, who had a really bizarre kind of trajectory into his sort of, I guess, quasi-political kind of religious career. So originally he was a Confucian scholar who started out trying to get an official position in the government, but he ended up failing the official examination 3 different times. Now, at some stage during this period, he ended up picking up one of these leaflets from Liang Fa and read about Christianity, but kind of ignored it. But around about the time that he failed his 3rd examination, he became quite delirious from sort of tragedy, I guess. He was so upset by it. So he went into this sort of state of delirium. And at some point during this state of delirium, he read the leaflet and came to believe, had this sort of kind of psychedelic dream, and came to believe that he was the brother of Jesus Christ. So he had this sort of nervous breakdown, had a hallucinogenic dream, and then woke up believing he was the brother of Jesus Christ, and he was sent to Earth to propagate Christianity within China. Now, bear in mind, he was also part of the Hakka ethnic group, who was sort of a marginalized group within that part of China during that time. He ended up radicalizing a lot of the local Hakka people to follow him, and that is what led to the Taiping Heavenly Rebellion. So in the end, the Taiping Heavenly Rebellion swept across southern China, eventually capturing the city of Nanjing and establishing the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, a very short-lived kingdom but a very interesting one, in which women were allowed to take imperial examinations and be government officials, and in which everyone was considered equally. So you had a lot of like prostitutes mingling with scholars, who were all treated as sort of equal members of society. However, the downside of that is that it led to the deaths of between 20 to 30 million people, but the death toll could have potentially been as high as 70 million. We don't actually know. It ended up crippling the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty in Chinese history, and it facilitated the downfall of imperial China. It ranks as the deadliest civil war in world history as well. It's an incredibly interesting period in Chinese history. I would urge you all to read about it. But for now, we'll wind down for today. I feel like I've blathered on enough. Now, if you could stop the recording.